The next session is Building Capacity and Enabling the A&D Industry Skills Base, moderated by Professor Anu Ocha, Director of the UK National Space Academy, a member of the Council at STFC, UK National Space Academy.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone. I am honoured to be chairing this panel discussion on one of the most critical factors, no matter what our subdivision between in the aerospace sector or in the space sector. And it's the issue of building human capacity to deliver our strategic and operational goals. And I'm delighted that we have two leaders in the field with whom we'll be having the discussion. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Reda Nidaku, the Vice President of Strategic Programs at Edge Group, and also Fahad Al-Mehri, who is the Acting Executive Director for the United Arab Emirates Space Agency. Gentlemen, thank you very much for giving your time. And I'd like to start, Reda, with your perspectives on what do you see as being the biggest skills gap for talent, for drawing in new people into the space sector and the wider aerospace and defense sectors?
So from a local perspective, I think we are lucky to be in the UAE, which is a hub of local talent, attracting talent from all over the world. Now, I guess design, R&D, product development are probably areas that were the least developed historically in the aerospace and defense because of the legacy focus of the industry. Now, the government and the industry focus in the last few years has been focusing on this. The creation of Edge itself is actually a proof of the direction towards capability building, product development, and technology development. Now, from a global perspective, I guess the main gap between supply and demand of talent has been in the recent years around digital skills, be it advanced data analytics, cyber skills, or digital skills in general. And this is due to three main drivers. The first one being we do not graduate enough STEM graduates and enough engineers compared to the needs of the jobs today. The second one is there is an increased competition towards this talent, and the aerospace and defense has been losing turf against other technology sectors like the big technology giants and so on. 20 years ago, the best engineers were actually systematically going to aerospace and defense. It is not the case anymore. And this is actually resulting on an aging audience and more challenging succession planning. Another area where the aerospace and defense has been lagging is diversity. The presence of female in the aerospace and defense remains very low. It's reported that only 22% of the aerospace and defense talent is female, and it's actually even lower in the engineering audience. So only 15% of aerospace and defense engineers are female. Now, the third aspect is aerospace and defense has missed the opportunity to upskill and reskill in mass its audience when it comes to new technologies and when it comes to digital. So today, the aerospace and defense, unfortunately, is perceived as less modern than it should be. This is due to a lot of legacy reasons like long product development life cycles, heavy regulations and certification requirements, the fact that the sector itself is manpower heavy and so on, which makes actually the changes a little bit more difficult. So today we definitely see a huge gap in aerospace and defense between the R&D, innovation teams and so on versus the rest of the population.
Thank you, Reda. And Fahad, I'd be very interested in your perspectives, specifically looking at the UAE space sector. And just before you start, one thing that links nicely with what Reda was saying, I have been really impressed in my involvement with the UAE because many of the aerospace and defense and certainly space programs globally, country by country, have evolved. But because the UAE is a young nation, I have seen how instead of having an evolutionary approach, there has been a strategic design approach from the outset for the establishment specifically of space activities in the UAE. I cannot speak for the wider aerospace sector in the UAE. And so, Fahad, over to you for the challenges in terms of skills, pipeline, drawing new talent for our space sector.
Thank you, Anu, and really interesting to hear, from Radha's side, coming from the aerospace and defense side, which, I was previously in the last 4.5 years. So now coming into space, it's quite a different dynamic, which I'm seeing. So first of all, really, the question posing in terms of the biggest skill gaps, for me, I really want to start by saying that I really don't believe when it comes into the space aspect that a talent gap really exists today. There is something else that I believe that is missing. So of course, my focus looking at the space sector, which includes various fields from satellite design, manufacturing, the AIT aspects, astronomy, and especially the downstream side of the science in the field. If we're talking about UAE nationals from the space sector side, first of all, the UAE is still really young in the sector, right? We have less than a handful of entities that are actually capable of designing and operating a satellite. But today we have found that many entities do exist that do a lot of value add and downstream services when it comes to it. And there is a lot that they can bring to the table. Today, communications, global positioning satellites, optical imagery, and access to remote sensing satellites data, looking at weather forecasting, hazardous weather, storms, floods, environmental impacts. A lot of these things today, the capabilities that are out there are taken for granted. How does this information really come up there? But it's really the underlying service to many of these things today, even down to just tracking your pizza on the way to your house nowadays. It's all possible due to this, ability of space and the services that this offers. So when it comes to identifying the skill gaps, we first need to look at the global aspects of the industry. The economic value of going to space was not something that anyone other than governments could really support. But the opportunities that have emerged in making that possible has now shown as an amazing catalyst for technology and industrial growth, and remains to this day an extraordinary difficult feat to accomplish. There have been failures and lives have been lost to get to where the sector is today. But I think without those failures and the passion of the people to do better and to do what's right, we wouldn't be in this new space era we are in today. We've seen that within the last decade, the push is more and more coming from the private sector through government needs and support programs from leadership and great minds that are really making this happen today. And the private sector has the will, and they will find the way as, the returns are becoming clear, with access to space becoming a lot cheaper, thanks to the technology that the private sector is really bringing today. And the UAE's interest in astronomy and space sciences really dates back to the 1970s, when our late father, His Highness Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, may his soul rest in peace, met with 3 astronauts from the Apollo 17 mission. And this encounter really eventually inspired the birth of the national space sector with the establishment of Thuraya Communications Company. This was back in 1997. Alya Soyasat Satellite Communications Company in 2007. In 2006, the Emirates Institution for Advanced Science and Technology, which was really pushed and aimed to promote the science of space and scientific research in the UAE. And in April 2015, the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center was created, which incorporated the EIAST into it. The existence of these entities and the access to the international market, as Ridha mentioned, we are so open to the international market here in the UAE. And, we're a hub and a catalyst to so many different things. There have been about 50 or so entities that we have seen that exist in the UAE today, serving the downstream based services. And these are all very interesting capabilities and opportunities. And I believe there are over about 1,500 Emiratis involved throughout the sector today. With, as Ridha mentioned, where the mix of the gender, I think on the space side, it's really interesting because we do have quite a healthy mix of about 40% females in them. And I think a lot of that stems towards a lot of R&D aspects still being involved in it. So it's a lot of university work. There's a lot of science aspect, and it's not really physical, heavy mechanical work, but it's more really analytics and thinking, and that really drives that forward. You know, and I think through the last 10 years of growing the technical engineering skills of the youth, we have thousands of graduates out of the STEM fields every year coming, you know, from UAE nationals and really graduating here in the UAE. I think today the challenge comes in finding the right opportunities for them to put their skills to the test and let them gain the experience through hard work within the field to gain the experience and knowledge they need. And I believe the gap today is not based on the talent or skills. It solely lies with them having the opportunities to gain real world experience. And this only happens naturally and organically, right? You can't force this. It's not something that you can do, you know, immediately. It does take time. And I think we have seen a shift all over the world the last decade with the introduction of nanosatellites, these CubeSats, and the services they are able to offer in comparison to, you know, the big monster 2-ton type satellites that today, you know, are orbiting Earth and providing a lot of the basic services that we see. But the ability for this has become so interesting that today it's universities that are actually launching these nanosats. And they're able to do this within a 3-year span. You know, we have seen stories of high school students actually participating in this and launching within less than 2 years a CubeSat, whatever the service is. But in the end, can you imagine a high school student who has gone through a systems engineering process in high school to go from designing to, you know, getting a satellite launched and analyzing the data and taking, you know, that's unheard of. And for us to be in this era today where this opportunity exists, I think it makes it so much easier, you know, for us to grow in the space field. You know, something like a systems engineer in the past, it would have taken more than 10 years to learn this on the job. And I think that's where the opportunity really comes in. You know, I believe we really need to have faith in our youth today and that they can do it better than we ever could. You know, it's the natural way of things. You know, we should be there to guide them, mentor them, create the foundations and tools, R&D and testing capabilities in place. Exactly what Rida mentioned. You know, these were the things that are missing. And through the knowledge of previous generations and our experiences to enable the acceleration of this into a real knowledge-based economy that allows us to be agile and quick to adopt and react to challenges ahead.
Fahad, your reflections there absolutely mirror my strategic and operational perspectives, because strategically as an advisor to UK government, but also to the European Space Agency in human spaceflight and exploration, we're really impressed with what's been accomplished in the UAE. But operationally, I've been involved through the work of His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Al-Ababi and his championship with working with youth in the UAE. And I have seen myself not only how students who I was teaching at high school level and at undergrad level are involved in CubeSat projects, but also very effectively how the inspirational draw of, for example, the astronaut program with Hazrat Al-Mansouri's increment on the ISS, but also the Al-Amal mission, is drawing people in, not just for exploration, but across the suite of space science activity, from satellite applications to astronomy. The recipe is working. Now, my perspectives are very much from the space side. Reda, going broader to the aerospace and defense sectors in the UAE, we've touched on this issue now, that we have multiple potential stakeholders. So we've got the needs of industry, we've got academia and education routes who are supplying and training that pipeline. And then we've got public awareness and business awareness. How do you think having our different stakeholders working more cohesively may be able to help us address the skills gaps that you've highlighted for the wider aerospace and defense sectors? Is there more coherence, more effective working that academia and industry and education and business can do together rather than in silos?
Definitely, and I can't agree more with Fahad in the fact that it is not about specific gaps as much as it is how can we together grow the overall pool of STEM graduates and engineers and keep them interested in the aerospace and defense. So that's why I would like to step back and get back to the 3 drivers that I have mentioned before. So first, we definitely should work together as governments and different industries in attracting more and more students to the STEM paths, to the engineering paths, to increase this pool and join our efforts in technologies, in incentives, in initiatives and competitions that will actually motivate the students to get to the STEM areas. The UAE Tech Focus has been clearly seen in all its latest strategies, priorities. The UAE Future Vision, for example, has played a central role actually in steering the discussion into attracting the youth to the STEM subjects, and also actually a lot of effort has been put in investing in education and rethinking the national curriculum with key areas going from ICT to space to nuclear and so on and so forth. The second driver is definitely repositioning aerospace and defense as a destination of choice of engineers. And here we need really to build on the mission itself of aerospace and defense, which is to transform the world, to secure the world, to make the world accessible to everyone, and actually re-emphasize the strengths and the opportunities that aerospace and defense offers actually and could offer to this youth. In EDGE, for example, we have partnered with Tawazun last year in a program called SEEDS, where we give the opportunities to students in universities to get embedded in the industry, be part of development projects, and actually get to experience from the inside what the industry can offer. And this has had very, very good results because it is really very practical. We should definitely also have a very clear and accurate and compelling value proposition towards female engineer. I understand that in the space, it is probably not as much the issue because the space is probably a younger sector in the UAE, which also...
Definitely.
Exactly, which took advantage of the fact that at the moment in the UAE, more than 50% of the STEM graduates are actually female, versus the aerospace and defense with an aging population that's more or less 50 years old average in the world has probably took less advantage of that. The third driver that I would like to highlight here is continuous upskilling and reskilling of the workforce to align to new technologies. And here, I believe that the industries together, along with the education system, could join forces as well to actually design specific job-targeted and job-specific trainings. The initiative that Google has announced recently in pretty much job-oriented training that will be actually as much relevant as a university degree, if not more relevant than a university degree in the talent acquisition process of Google. I think the last point I would like to raise here is supporting government initiatives, competitions, and so on is also an obligation on the industry to keep the youth and keep the talent interested in STEM and in technology. At EDGE, we have recently sponsored Mohammed bin Zayed International Robotics Competition, and we were amazed the talent that we could meet there and the interest that we could drive through that competition.
Thank you, Redan. What's interesting there is looking at those perspectives that you are having and how they link in with some of the perspectives that Fahad has. We have the interesting perspective of the aging workforce, which is a challenge in the wider aerospace sector. But of course, with the relatively youthful workforce that we have for the UAE space sector. Going to Fahad, we're looking at the design very successfully of the small and growing skills programs for the UAE Space Agency and for the UAE space sector. What further work needs to be done then to let the academic, industrial, and education providers work together? Because we're seeing it with individual projects. Are you seeing that this is now embedding itself strategically and operationally and growing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is so much work that's been done, by various sectors and ministries in the UAE to make that happen. But, today it's expected that a new hire really bring new insights, new ideas into the fields that they come into. It needs that passion, and that can-do mindset. And it really all starts at the young age, and a lot can be discussed, of course, in that regards. But I won't go that far, you know. Maybe at a later discussion we can definitely talk about it. But you mentioned the aspect of inspiration, right? You mentioned how maybe the UAE has done it a little differently, you know. So let's look into that. You know, Hazza Al Mansouri, the first Emirati and Arab to board the International Space Station, you know, was a huge inspiration to the UAE, not just to the youth, but to the Arabs and to the region and everybody around the world who saw the UAE as a small country, you know, less than 10 million residents in population. How has this been possible, you know? And anybody who has ever experienced, you know, the being at a launch or seeing a launch or being part of that experience, you'll never forget that. And that'll stick with kids. You know, it will stick with people. And that is where the passion really and aspects really come through. So, you know, as mentioned, it's the opportunities and experience that we are able to share. So yes, governments are expected to lead the way. And I think the UAE has an amazing story, you know, in progress with the Emirates Mars mission. You know, it was really made possible by the vision of our great leadership in the UAE, where UAE nationals were tasked to deliver this endeavor. You know, it wasn't an opportunity for them to go out and buy something and do it. I mean, they were asked to go through this where they have no experience in interplanetary scale work, you know, when it comes to going to Mars. It's something very different than launching the satellites. The UAE has done that already, and the MBRSC have shown that that is possible. But the scale of interplanetary capability, that wasn't there. And as I mentioned, buying a satellite was off the table. So the option of working with big companies also who have done this before was also not something that was accepted. So the real task was for this to be designed, built, integrated, tested, and operated by UAE nationals. And then the science behind that as well to be looked at and studied by UAE nationals, analyzed and you know, distributed and disseminated to the rest of the world. You know, this is where the EMM team really sought out knowledge partners. It's about doing it differently, right? How do we go about this? And this is something that is really inspirational. You know, we took a different path and they took a different track, and it was about the knowledge partners in the US that they managed to get the support of, who have helped guide the UAE nationals through the process they went through, from the design, the testing, modifications, the changes in direction, the decisions, you know, all done through proper testing and analytics. And today, these guys are operating the satellite. You know, they're in touch with it now only twice a week for about 6 hours, where the first month and a half they were in touch with it 24 hours, testing everything. And it's a team of UAE nationals sitting at these consoles, at these operating tables, running 12-hour shifts with engineering and backup team and everybody there to take a look at how we can test everything. And it took 6 years to get where, you know, to where they are today in this journey. There is, of course, more to come when you look at it, because the science aspect still needs to come in. When the ML, well, let's say Musbar al-ML or the Hope probe instruments start to collect the data, you know, now the focus is on retrieving that data and analyzing and distributing that data to the science community, you know, years after Mars orbit insertion. So the passing of the last 6 years have given about 200 UAE nationals the experience and the opportunity to be really fully immersed into this, to be accountable and responsible in front of the leadership as well. And this has really given them the grit and given them the experience to close the gap that we talk about today. And today, you know, with the opportunity of the access in space getting a lot cheaper, our aim as the UAE Space Agency is to really support the private sector by facilitating networking, support cross-selling, offering everything the UAE environment has to offer to grow the space sector. We want to support the UAE nationals and residents to show that space is no longer out of a startup's reach. There has many stories out in the world where startups from universities are now competing in the global space sector. And this is what we want to encourage. As the space agency, we aim to facilitate, and we facilitate to accelerate the growth of the space sector. You know, and as you mentioned, you know, you've seen the DG in action yourself, you know, and the agency has been really taking a holistic view of the situation. And we have several platforms and programs that have allowed us to link people passionate about space from the young age of being in high school, you know, to really taking them through university, graduate programs, and pushing them through into entrepreneurs with the support of academia and the industry and the space sector, which is so tightly knit. And it's been really great to see. And it's become a fantastic catalyst to really support the growth of the knowledge-based economy. And through this, we really aim to support the creation of sustainable space economy here in the UAE that is only possible through really closing that gap that you talk about.
Absolutely, and interestingly, from the sort of science and exploration perspectives that I have from ESA, we're really impressed that the astronaut program, we've just had the second astronaut selection finishing. We know that there are long increments for 6 months planned for UAE astronauts in the next few years. And obviously we have the Amal mission's science yield from Mars. I think what the public then see is that this is a long-term strategic commitment. And because it is drawing people in, the other thing I've seen within the UAE space sector is much less siloization than elsewhere. You go elsewhere in the world, and many of the people in satellite applications know very little operationally of what's going on in exploration and vice versa. But I think because of small is beautiful sometimes, you can have this cross-fertilization. The challenge, of course, as you expand, is to maintain it. I want to return to a point that you made, Reda, in your opening statement, which is the future challenges and the challenges. You talk about the digital economy, and I would also say the challenges of a future in which AI and robotics are far more embedded, AI specifically. So if I look at digital economy and AI challenges for the future and those skills requirements that are going to be needed for aerospace and defense, how can organizations be even more proactive in what they're doing to future-proof themselves from a skills point of view in this really rapidly changing landscape?
Yeah, when it comes to digital and emerging technologies, I think first we need to maintain a very active market watch and to follow the technology trends and constantly ask ourselves, how does it impact? What are the potential implications and opportunities that it brings to the sector in general, but also to each of the jobs? And here, I would like to emphasize that the HR organizations of the industry need to play a much more strategic role than the operational role that it could play in some instances. In Edge, for example, the HR team has driven a Jobs of the Future study, which was a very data-driven analysis of the Edge workforce profile, and it projected it into actually what could be the skills needed in the future, what could be the jobs, how do the jobs will look like in the future at Edge, based on the projects of the future, based on the trends of technologies and so on. So now what is required? This study has been very insightful. It actually confirmed that in fact, Edge jobs will be transformed in the next few years because of AI, because of robotics, because of automation. So the question today becomes, how do we maximize the benefit from data, from automation, and how do we dare actually transforming the way we work, changing the tools we use today? And it's not much about jobs not being needed anymore, as much as it is jobs being done in a different way, and the expectation from the talent being different into much more value-adding activities versus transactional activities. The second key aspect I see here is a comprehensive approach towards talent development and really embedding new technologies, new trends in the training and talent development from pre-onboarding, like Google does, for example, into retiring. In Edge, we have launched last year a comprehensive digital transformation program that has actually a very serious drive into training people and actually bringing in awareness into Industry 4.0 technologies and sitting with each team and trying to understand how do these technologies actually affect their day-to-day work? How could they affect their day-to-day work? And trying to imagine with them, how could the process of today look tomorrow and how do we get prepared for that? Last but not least, I think we definitely need to partner with the education system from very early on and actually try to contribute as an industry into fine-tuning the curriculums, bringing in more industry views to the curriculums, and also some of the very practical knowledge, either through projects, through internships, and so on. We are working very closely with the Ministry of Education and ADIC, for example, into these lines. We have also been in touch with the latest initiative in Abu Dhabi, which is called Abu Dhabi 42, so that we see how EDGE can actually contribute to these initiatives and how can we actually leverage all the knowledge that these students will be taken in such coding academy.
And Fahad, my impression when we look at these challenges that Reda has outlined is that based on the factors you talked about early, the agency and the space sector in the UAE is already incorporating these very effectively. So is there more work still to be done in further preparing young people for a future which will be AI and digital dominated?
I mean, honestly, this is where I really felt a big change, moving from the defense sector into the space sector, where all of a sudden your stakeholders really open up. And the fact that you have professors and academia and students engaged was just absolutely mind-blowing to think, wow, we have access to these people. There is interest, we can share problems with them, and we can have them really look at seeing what can be done and focus on it. I mean, there are many programs in place today, two within the UAE Space Agency. One is the Global Space Industry Accelerator. And this has been something we've been running virtually now, where in the past we were actually running this, physically in meetings at universities. And the amazing thing is we usually had about 60, 70 attendees at these seminars, but at the last sessions, we are seeing up to 400 or 500 people joining these sessions. So it really shows how this, age of digital economy, I mean, let's face it, this wouldn't have been possible, and it wouldn't have happened maybe if COVID wasn't around. I mean, I can tell you within the space agency, we were looking at going virtual probably 6 months ago, right? 6 months before the COVID situation. And so when the COVID situation came up, we were ready day one from the lockdown to continue our business and move that. And so we didn't lose one day of work. And in fact, it just really accelerated everything that we could because of what we're doing, because of the access that we have, not only locally, but internationally, so we can talk to different parts of the country in one day, something that was never achievable in the past. So there's so much more that can be done today. And, the programs that we've been running are really great because it really ties in academia and the professors in together with the industry, really creating that knowledge-based economy. And there is so much that has come out of it. We have run a couple of, we've run a competition actually. 150 applicants came and put forward applications to new startup concepts and ideas. And teams were created. We narrowed these guys down, and we have 4 of these companies now who have gone through an incubation phase over the last 3 months. And we have brought forward, European angel investors who have come in, and all of them have found key interests, and all of them have been supported now. So it's really great to see how just that concept and that idea has allowed us to really make it all happen, from student to entrepreneurs to really industry, finding problems and bringing solutions to really closing that gap. So it's been absolutely amazing that we've been able to do that in this short period of time, with the whole world being part of it. And I think, when it comes to the digital economy, it's really interesting. I mean, autonomy is a must in space, right? The communications, let's say with the EMM, it takes 20 minutes, I can't tell it what to do. I can't steer it. I can't operate it. It has to think for itself. It has to follow its own protocols, and everything has to be pre-programmed and set into it. And it needs to have the sensors to detect where it is, what's the situation, and take decisions on its own. I mean, it's an organic growth when you come into the digital era, but it is something that we can definitely accelerate. I mean, in my days in university, the hacking aspect of, the computers and the digital side was, that was like, some people knew about it and it was heard and rumors were there and it was talked about, but, it was a crime, and it was, it was dangerous stuff. My 4-year-old came to me last week and he says, Baba, I found a hack for Minecraft, I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's telling me about this 14-digit hacking code that, and he just spells it right out there for me, a 4-year-old. So, nowadays by the time a toddler is 2 years old or able to hold something, he's holding technology in his hands, you know? And so for us today, I think it's really important to do what has been done at the agency and really run with that aspect of identifying these students at a young age, right? Those go-getters, those people who really can make a difference today and who have that confidence. And what we've done is, you know, we were there, we have programs to identify these kids, and we've taken them, supported them in high school, send them some information, make them part of certain launches, send virtual links to them today, just send them notifications of, oh, hey, this is happening in the space world today. It gives them things to read, it gives them knowledge, and it gives them this inspiration to really look at it. And this is something we've been doing, and we've taken these kids through universities. And now we are sponsoring some of these in PhD levels for very niche, very specific space-related PhDs. And these are the people who can really come back and drive certain things in the sector. And that's where really the future drive of the digital economy really comes, you know, and we can really proactively help and through seeking that and you know, real hands-on and knowledge transfer programs, because this leads to the know why. You know, you have to have the kids asking the questions. Why do I do this? Why should I do it this way? And that is really, you know, when you have people in that domain, that's where you can really drive capabilities, and that's what allows for continuous innovation and growth. And it's not dependent on a certain project. It's nonstop, ever evolving, and it will just continue. So, you know, that's really all I have to add on that basis. But, you know, we can, I can keep going, but because it really, it's a topic I think that the space side, it can really pull that inspiration out of the youth. And it's something we really need to rely on today to drive the UAE forward.
Gentlemen, thank you. We've had a wide-ranging discussion, and what strikes me is the optimism that characterizes everything that I've had the privilege of being involved with in the UAE. You know, the trajectory is right, and the future really is, in terms of ambition and human capacity and potential, it's out there. So just in conclusion, I'd just like to bring things down to just, if you had one key bit of advice, not strategically, but you would be giving to young people to come into the space sector, Fahad, and the wider aerospace and defense sectors, you know, what would that one piece of advice or wisdom be? Reda?
I think from my side, it would be to try to have as many interactions with the industry as possible throughout their scholarship and throughout their education. I think it is very important for the student to actually understand the opportunities that each of the sectors provide, the types of projects that he could be working on, so that he takes actually an informed decision when he graduates into one, which type of job he wants to take, and second, in which sector.
And Fahad?
I echo a lot of what Rada just said. Really, it's really all about capturing that and taking advantage of the opportunities that exist. You know, it's very easy for the youth these days to sit around and be bored and say, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. You know, I don't know what I'm going to be. But honestly, you know, it's for us as parents, as you know, people who have gone through that, and you know, I feel responsible at the Space Agency today to make sure that we give that opportunity and we facilitate that opportunity to the students. And we're actually doing this today as well, not just for the UAE, but also for the Arab world. His Highness launched the Arab Space Pioneer Program. And this is something now we're looking at reflecting, you know, the UAE's, let's say, programs and the capabilities, and actually opening that up to the wider Arab region. So for us as the UAE Space Agency, we really aim to facilitate all of that. And the reason, again, we want to facilitate all of that, because it's our drive to accelerate the growth of the space sector. So if you are passionate and you are key and you have capabilities, you know, seek us out, and we will try to link you up with the right, you know, mentors. We will try to link you up with the right establishments that exist throughout the UAE that can really help drive that talent, and you know, give the youth that are watching, or even parents that are watching today, you know, the tools that they need to succeed and be part of the space sector in the future. Thank you, Anu.
Fahad, Reda, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your perspectives. And ladies and gentlemen in the audience, thank you. I hope it's given you some food for thought, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Global Aerospace Summit 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, shukran. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.